Hello, my name is Richard Fisher, and I'm here to help you navigate through the book of Romans. The video right now that we're doing is Romans 1:18 to 4:25. The title of this video is called Bad News, Good News. Now, Paul introduces his letter with good news. He talks about the salvation, which is by faith in Jesus Christ, and reconciliation to God by receiving God's righteousness. But he opens his sermon in 1:18 on a negative note. He talks about the wrath of God. Now, why would he do this? Why does he come from a negative perspective? I've often wondered why Paul did this, but when you begin to look at the entire book, you understand. You see, a right standing before God brings blessing. It's almost like standing on Mount Gerizim and talking about the blessings of God. But rebellion and rejection of God brings cursing or wrath. That's like standing on Mount Ebal and saying, "Cursed be those who disobey and follow the ways of the evil one." Actually, Paul is starting to talk about righteousness, but he does it from this negative point of view. Because if you talk about righteousness and you want to establish it and you want to proclaim how righteous you are and then measure yourself before God, you'll find that you don't measure it according to your standard, but God's. And the flip side of righteousness is justice. And when you stand before God and claim to be righteous and in actuality you are evil, then you do not receive his blessing, you receive his wrath. Now, why would Paul actually start out talking about bad news? It's because he wants to deal with reality. You see, both the Gentile and the Jew are self-convinced that they are righteous, even if it is on their own terms. They're blinded and just do not understand or see that they have missed the mark and that they have no standing, no righteous standing with God. You see, everyone is guilty under God's wrath. Everyone needs to be made right and reconciled to God. Now, what we find in Romans chapter 1:18, we find that the world in general rebelled and separated itself from God, and then it tried to establish its own righteousness. But it could not. They could not even keep their own law. So we have the Gentiles who cannot keep their law. And so Paul then turns to the Jews and he speaks to the Jews, and we find the same thing. We have the Jews and they don't keep the law. Now, the law here was a little bit different. With the Gentiles, they made up their own law, which came from their consciences, and they could not even keep that. And they judged people from their own law, therefore making them guilty. The Jews were given the law by God. They were the specially chosen family to be involved in bringing the plan of salvation and pointing to Jesus Christ. And they had the law that was God's gift to them, but they couldn't even keep it. Now, they judged others for not keeping it, but they themselves could not keep it. And because of that, they were declared unrighteous. Now, when everyone is unrighteous and joined together, we all become guilty before God. Now, this brings us to Paul's second part of this passage here. And here, he's talking about salvation. The bad news is that we are all under God's wrath. But the good news is that God has provided a way of salvation. And we see that in the midst of guiltiness, our guilt, God the proper choice, it would seem, would be to bring wrath, to bring cursing, to deal with unrighteousness the way it should be. But God, in his mercy, makes a way for us. And that way is through Jesus Christ. And we're going to put the cross, a symbol of the cross here. And that way is through Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ bore our wrath by his death, and through his life of resurrection, God declares us righteous. So in other words, the righteousness or the justice of God is satisfied by the death of Jesus Christ, who dies in our place, bearing our wrath. And then when he raises from the dead, then his life provides the validity for being declared righteous by God. Now the question you ask when you look at this good news, bad news, is how am I to respond to it? And that's why Paul is developing his passage the way he is. When everyone realizes that they stand guilty before God, they're all sinners, they're under his wrath, they've tried their own way of righteousness, they have not been able to keep the law, and they are now standing before God and without an answer. But God has the answer. He provides a way through Jesus Christ, who bears our wrath and declares us righteous. Now the question is this: how is this righteousness appropriated? The wrath has been borne, the righteousness is available, but how is it appropriated? It's not by self-effort through the law. We've already established that. It's not by works of the law. We've already established that. It is by believing in the word and the promise of God. That's how we appropriate the righteousness. You see, God is the one who establishes the righteousness. And we believe him, and we place our faith in the work of Jesus Christ. And we find this being discussed in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, Paul uses Abraham's life, his faith, his journey from the Old Testament stories to illustrate and to validate both of those. The power of believing the gospel of Jesus Christ. To summarize what Paul has said in this passage, we have 4 truths. We are unrighteous and stand guilty before God, but God graciously has provided a way and called us to reconciliation. We respond in faith, and then God imputes his righteousness.